Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reedy with Future Pastimes, and I'm a designer on the expansions for the classic Dune board game published by Gale Force 9. And I had a question came up in response to one of the other videos that I've posted here on this channel. And it was about the design process specifically for Dune and the expansions, all the new stuff that we brought in. We have our third expansion now. And what is the process for that? And there were two questions that came out of it. One was, how do we go about testing all of the new stuff? And the other was about balancing the new materials in terms of strategy, skill, and luck. Or is that something that the table itself of all of the players, are they responsible for making that happen? So I'm going to do a video, and that's this video, and discuss a little bit about our design process and our test process and how we come about coming to those conclusions. So I'm going to give you first a little bit of background. And in that question, there were some comparisons between Cosmic Encounter and Dune. And Cosmic Encounter has a reputation for being a little more freeform and chaotic, where Dune has a reputation as being a very specific and focused strategy game. Now, I'm a big fan of both of them, and they are both originally designed by the same three people, Bill Eberly, Jack Kittredge, and Peter Olatka, who are, to varying degrees, still involved in the various expansions for both of those games. So they still have input on that. I started off just as a super fan to an absurd degree, but now I am officially part of Future Pastimes and able to design and work with those designers. And I would say that the overlap between Cosmic Encounter and Dune, if it's a Venn diagram, there's definitely some overlap, and that is particularly in the variable player power mechanism, which is where each player has a unique thing that they can do in the game that the other players cannot do. And in some ways, their unique advantage or ability is bending or breaking a rule that is set out in the game. So that is something that Cosmic Encounter first developed, and that mechanism was then applied to Dune. There's not a lot else in the overlap. I mean, to some degree, Cosmic Encounter is a little bit of an area control game, not in a way that most people would describe it, but you're trying to get 5 foreign colonies in order to win. In Dune, you're trying to control 3 strongholds in order to win. Cosmic Encounter, of course, you can cohabitate those planets, and multiple players can win together. And the alliances are much more fleeting. They're more formalized in Dune, and you're not sharing the strongholds with the other players. And in your basic setup, of course, there's only 5 strongholds, so it's not possible for somebody to be in 3 and for somebody else to also be in 3. Now, the expansions do mess around with that, but let's set that to the side just for the moment. So I see these as 2 very distinctly different games. Nevertheless, I find that there are lessons to be learned and things that can be gleaned from one game to another. Now, for the longest time, Dune was basically just the 6 factions, and that was it. They had the 6 factions, and a lot of players, especially players who are my age or older, that's how they see Dune. It's a hermetically sealed experience. It's the 6 factions, and you develop your skills as a player by just playing with those 6 factions, and that's the real test, is how well can you do against other players of similar skill level, employing your knowledge of the game, your familiarity with the treachery deck, and the what has been played and who has what, and being able to leverage all of those things in a way that lets you get yourself to victory if a fairly narrow range of things go your way. So there is certainly a luck in there, the luck of the draw in the treachery deck, especially when most of the players don't know what it is that they're buying. That can have a major factor on the game, and it can take a few turns for you to cycle out the cards that are not going to help you win to try to get to the cards that will. You have to manage your spice and how that's going to enable you to get onto the board and to win battles and to get the cards that you need and to get your forces out after you've lost. So that's a major factor, which is not at all present in Cosmic Encounter. So I liken it to a bit of a chess-like experience. Chess is its own fixed environment. There's no surprises in terms of what's going to be in the game. It's just a matter of, can you outmaneuver the other player? And Dune is like that. But the way I look at adding in new factions, for example, is that's just something that you need to familiarize yourself with, just like anything else. The first time you played Dune, you didn't immediately grok all the strategy for playing Harkonnen or the Emperor and like, oh yeah, this is fine. You had to get used to the advantages, how they interacted with the other factions, and the contents of the treachery deck. Well, adding in the expansions is just something else, something new to get used to. And so for me, I've been playing Dune for 30 years or longer. I'm very familiar with the base game stuff. I know what's in there. I do a very good job of saying, well, all right, well, 3 shields have come up and I've got 1, so nobody has protection against projectile defense. But now adding in the new stuff, you just have to play through it. You just have to immerse yourself in it, just like you did with the base game. So it's just an extension of that. It's not a new concept. If it were up to us, we would have added 50 new factions to Dune. The only reason that we haven't is because we are, one, limiting ourselves to a very narrow timeline. It's in and around the events of the first book of Dune, not very much farther into the future, and only a little bit into the past, thinking geriatric spice keeps you alive longer, so characters from 20 or 30 years in the past could still be around. And that's it. So we're limited by that. And then, of course, we're limited by what's been published. Are there factions and are there enough characters? There are various other houses that are mentioned, House Hagel, but there's not a whole lot of characters for it. So one of the things that we have not done is just make up new factions out of whole cloth. Now, other people have started to do that in the homebrew community for Dune, and I think eventually I will. I'll just say, look, I'm going to make up some new factions. Now, these will not be published. They will not be official, so they'll be semi-official. But there's a lot of really interesting things that could be done inside the context of how Dune works, the board game. All those phases and what you're trying to accomplish. There are some amazing effects that could be applied to new factions. So I love the idea of having in there, and that is something that we've taken from Cosmic Encounter, which was really the first game that said, here's expansions for the game that add more of this and some new stuff. And in the Fantasy Flight Edition, we have the largest number of aliens ever published for Cosmic Encounters, well over 200. And all of those new aliens change up how the game behaves, and it makes the game fresh and exciting and interesting and unpredictable, which I like. And I like those qualities in Dune, which is why I am a fan of the expansions, because for me, it gets to the point where it's a little bit stale in that everything is much easier to figure out, especially 6 really skilled, long-time players of Dune. Not that it's not interesting or fun, it still is, but I like to add in some fresh stuff or some surprises. And I like this idea of I've got to really figure out the best way to leverage my advantages with this new faction in terms of a mix of other factions that some may be old, some may be new. So that is the context that we have as designers going into what motivates us to design for Dune. Now, the testing process usually starts fairly internal with Future Pastimes. We think of some ideas. A lot of it comes from the Peter Alatka school of, while I'm playing a game, I'm thinking about something I really wish I could do that I know I can't do. There's no effect that allows me to do this. But maybe that would be something a faction could do, or a new treachery card would let me do. And so we capture that, and we think about that when we're starting to design something. A lot of the design for Dune, because it is based specifically on stuff from the books, we're trying to capture that. So when we sat down to design the Ixians and Tleilaxu, looking at the Tleilaxu, certain things were like, well, yeah, obviously they're going to interact with the Tleilaxu tanks. But we think, what is the big thing that everyone thinks about with the Tleilaxu? And it's the face dancers. And so that was a major thing, is we wanted to find a way to recreate that experience in the context of the Dune board game. And that's how our face dancer advantage was developed. So it's driven by stuff that this would be an interesting new mechanism, and then looking at the thematics. So one of the earliest ideas I had for House ECAS was this idea of co-occupy. I really wanted to have a faction that could be in the stronghold with their ally, and that's something that nobody can do. I thought that would be interesting. And in reading through those books, that theme of alliance was very prevalent for House ECAS. They were desperately trying to form a formal alliance with House Atreides through marriage. The Archduke, Armand ECAS, was fond of and respected Duke Leto, and vice versa. So they were like, this will be good. I think it'll be mutually beneficial. It strengthens both of our positions. And Leto, even though he was still in love with Lady Jessica, he was not married to her because he knew that forging an alliance was going to be an important thing that he allowed himself to do. He needed to be open to it, and here was an opportunity. It was a good fit, and so he felt like, yeah, I will grow to love Alessa ECAS, and I think it'll be a really good alliance for us. And so they were keen on that. That alliance theme is very much central to what we wanted to do with House ECAS. And then we just looked at other ways of trying to build on that. Conversely, the big takeaway in reading about House Mortani was what bastards they were, especially the Viscount. He was completely unscrupulous. So that idea of terrorism and terror tactics led to terror tokens. And in terms of the game mechanism and how we would do that, I felt like the terror tokens, the players know that there's a terror token there, but they don't know what it does. It does terrify them. The players are very leery about moving into that stronghold because they don't want to be the victim of what's going to happen there. And that has had an amazing effect on the game. So that is what drives a lot of the decision process in designing. And then we typically play test amongst ourselves within Future Pastimes. If we've got Jack Kittredge and Bill and Peter in there, and then Greg Alaka, who's also part of Future Pastimes. That's 5 of us right there. So we can do a 5-player game to get a sense of the basic mechanisms and say, yeah, this works, this doesn't work. And then as soon as it reaches a certain threshold of this is playable, I like to bring in outside testers. And we've got a fairly sizable pool of Dune players that are interested in testing out the new Dune stuff. And it waxes and wanes. So we get new people in, and then some of the old people go out, and there's some people that have stuck with it the whole time. And I like having a large playtest pool. One is it makes it easier to schedule games. We like to play with 4, 5, and especially 6 players because most Dune players think 6 is optimal and won't even play it at fewer than 6. So we've got to make sure that we play it, and we have to play through the basic advantages as well as the advanced advantages. And the advanced advantages, I'm relying more on the playtester pool than I am with Future Pastimes because they designed basic. They didn't design advanced. So they have to be reacquainted with some of the rules when we play advanced. And, after they're like, oh, yeah, I get it, let's play it again. And then they pick up on it fairly quickly. But majority of the advantages that a new faction has are going to be basic advantages anyway. So most of the factions, they have 1 or 2 advanced advantages. And they're usually not hard to figure out anyway. So it just involves many iterations of playing through and testing it out, and we have to test it out in different combinations, not just the players, but the factions involved. With the 3rd expansion, ECAS and Mortani, we have 12 factions, and so we've got to play things with the base game factions and the other expansion factions to see. It's less about, does this work? And it's more about how do we deal with interesting and unusual edge cases and then trying to get the wording down to account for stuff like that. One of the things you always have to factor in is advisors. How do advisors affect this? And, we were like, all right, advisors are not going to trigger the ECAS ambassador tokens. But we felt like, you know what? It's terrorism, and it should work against as many players in the way that they don't like as much as possible. So we decided advisors can trigger the terror tokens. Mauritania wants to blow up a bunch of Bene Gesserit spiritual advisors. He should be allowed to do it. So it's figuring out that what makes for more interesting and compelling gameplay, and a lot of that comes out of the play testing. We'll have an unusual situation that will come up, and then we have to circle the wagons and think about, all right, how do we want to deal with this? What outcome do we want to have here? What would be the most interesting for gameplay? Is this going to swing things too far in one direction or another? And then trying to adjust it. So I call it adjusting the dials. There's a lot of that happens in the gameplay. After game, we were like, yeah, we got to reword this to account for X, Y, or Z, or this advantage is just not really working out. It's fine, but when you factor in the Emperor and him being able to give spice to the ally, this doesn't work. One of the early things that we wanted to have for Chom was an alternate win condition. We thought, if they can just accumulate so much spice, let's have them win. But then we're like, if the Emperor just gives them a bunch of spice so they share the win, and then we're like, should we make it something or they only can do this alone? But that presented some other problems, and ultimately we ended up dropping it, and it just came out of the gameplay. One of the things that the playtesters are great at is trying to break a new idea or a new advantage. We had that I mentioned in another video with Homeworlds, where we had one of the first play tests of that. Somebody they had the laser gun in a shield, and they sent one force to somebody's homeworld where they had like 10 or 12 reserves, and just to blow them all up. And well, like I said, we had a good laugh about it, but clearly we didn't want that to be a factor. So we added something that would account for that. And that's what's going to happen out of the play testing. And every once in a while, some certain edge case just doesn't come up over 50, 60 playtest games. And somehow somebody will buy the expansion in their first game. They're like, what about this situation? And we're like, all right, well, that never came up before. We hadn't foreseen it. And that's the downside of, you're adding in more variants or more factions. You've got, a much higher combination of possibilities, many of which you can predict, but not all of them. If we had the luxury of playtesting for 5 years, we might come up with everything, and we might find the perfect way to word everything where even somebody who English is not their primary language couldn't misinterpret. And that's a lot of times it's just, this is a idiosyncratic, you know what I'm trying to say. This is a colloquialism to America, that if we phrase things this way, and other countries are like, well, this is how I interpret that. And we're like, all right, I can see how you would interpret that. And we're sometimes so close to the trees, we don't see the full forest. And so we're counting on Gale Force 9. They have some editors, especially their translators, are real good at picking up on stuff. They're like, you got to rephrase this because this is what this means in this language. And we don't want to have it interpreted that way. And the playtesters pick up on a lot of stuff, but something always slips through. For instance, we recently learned that players were interpreting that the ECAS ambassadors were played face down, which is an interesting idea, but they're supposed to be face up. Everybody knows which ambassador is in which stronghold. It's the opposite of Mauritania. Mauritania, they're face down. ECAS, they're face up. And so, again, as we were playtesting it, we all knew what it was, and that's how we did it. And when you triggered one, you turned it face down to show that it had been used up. So as an easy way to track that. But yeah, same thing happened with the HMS. There was in fact, it was a typo, but we all looked at it like 20 times, and we just didn't even sink in. So it happens all the time. Sorry, but that's life. So in terms of trying to figure out how to balance and how to leverage skill, strategy, and luck, because there's always a certain amount of luck, and a lot of that luck again is with the treachery cards. You've got some worthless cards in there. You've got some specials that it's an interesting effect, but you may not want to double a Spice Blow, or you may not need the Tleilaxu Gola. You may be afraid to even try to use a True Trance. That's probably not a real one, but a lot of people are like, I want the weapons, I want the defenses, especially the special ones, if for no other reason to keep them out of other people's hands. But it's a luck of the draw. So you're trying to deal with that luck element in there, which is by and large the main area where there is luck. A lot of it is you're reading the board, you know how many forces are in the stronghold, you know how many forces could be brought into a stronghold from reserves, you know the strength of all of the leaders. There's not a lot of surprises in those ways. In advanced, you don't necessarily know how much spice somebody has so that they could spice dial. So that's an X factor that you'll have to deal with. But it's a skill strategy element, not so much a luck element. But as I mentioned earlier, I think that a lot of the skill and strategy for any of the new variants and factions simply comes from playing with them and familiarizing yourself with that in there. From the design perspective, again, as we come up with an idea, we test it out. We're looking for a variety of outcomes as a design strategy or objective, but we're looking to make sure that it doesn't swing too hard one way or another. An early test of the tech tokens, it was suggested that there was a larger income, but that immediately proved to be way too swingy. So the idea that your income increases by the number of tech tokens, I felt was a much better way to approach that. I didn't want to inject too much spice into the game from the tech tokens. So just a little bit is nice. Spice is nice, and even a little is better than none. Similarly with some of the other effects in the game, again, the leader skills, you're going to have some bigger peaks and valleys depending on which leader skill you get. Again, that's a little bit of a luck factor. Some of them you're trying to marry that up with a specific type of treachery card, but that's one of the reasons why we changed the setup. So you're getting your treachery card first before you're deciding which of the two leader skills to apply. But you get the situation where, like, yeah, I was dealt a projectile weapon, and then I got the Swordmaster of Gnaz as a leader skill that was dealt to me. So if I'm applying that to, I've got Stilgar, and I've got a Chris Knife, and he's a Swordmaster. He's strength 10, and so that's a big deal. That's about twice the average of any leader in the game. Is it too swingy? Well, I mean, again, it's public information, so the other players can deal with it. And so that was part of the question: is does the table have to contribute to balancing things out? And the answer is yes. But I think that was the case before. That's always been the case. If you've got the alliance between the Bene Gesserit and Atreides, and Atreides has helped them fill up their hand with great cards, that's a very powerful alliance. I always like to say that if the Bene Gesserit faction hadn't been part of the base game, and it was coming out now in Expansion 3, and the players looked at the voice as an advantage, we would get a lot of angry and incredulous comments from people like, this is so utterly broken. This is a terrible faction. People would hate it. They'd probably hate the Harkonnen keeping 4 traitors and having twice as many treachery cards. But you know what? They just, they're used to it now, so they accept it. And I think that once you get used to the new factions, you too will accept them. When the Tleilaxu first came out, I heard from a lot of the players who were reading it for the first time, and they thought that the face dancer mechanism was utterly broken. They're like, oh, look, you know, the Tleilaxu can win on turn 1 without even entering the board. They can just sit out and do nothing and win the game. And that is theoretically true, but it just is not really highly likely. It is so astronomical. They'd have to be dealt 3 traitor cards, and those 3 leaders would have to win battles on that turn and then have forces left over in every case. Again, in most games of the Tleilaxu, they don't even use all 3 of their face dancers. And in some games, they don't get to call face dancer at all. That is a luck area, but it's the luck of the draw. You're able to cycle them out at the end of each turn, one at a time. So you might increase your chances, but that's a very lucky thing. You're waiting for a leader. And, when people are dealt their traders, a lot of times they're taking the high strength traders. So the Tleilaxu are left with a bunch of low strength leaders, often also their own leaders. And if you're hoping that Uman Kadu is going to win a battle for you, that's probably not going to happen a lot. Trader Call will help Uman win a battle, but he's not winning it most of the time on his own. So again, this was the sort of thing we played through. We tested it thoroughly. It never happened once in any of our playtests. Very rarely did you have the Tleilaxu win the game on a Face Dancer Call in any of our playtests. But again, it's possible. And that tension, I think, is very interesting for gameplay, in my opinion, and extremely thematic. So I like that sort of thing in there. I like those surprises. I like a little bit of unpredictability in my board gaming and in Dune in particular. And so, again, as players get really familiar with all of the expansion material, you will, again, reset that leveling. So people who are like, I've been playing Dune, just the base game, for decades. I'm familiar with everything. I'm at this level. Now there's new material in there that I'm not familiar with, but the more you play with it, the more it'll level out again. That's what this means, by the way. I just did that. So that's really the process. I think to some degree the table does help balance the stuff out, and some of that will be familiarity with what the factions can do, what the new treachery cards are, and how they will behave, the odds of one of those things coming up in a particular battle. Like I said, I'm highly used to it, so I'm thinking about those sorts of things. Players who are less familiar with it are not thinking about it as much. But like I said, that was true the first dozen or so times that you played Dune. I remember it was 3 or 4 games before I even saw Family Atomics. I didn't even know that could happen in the game. I was like, what are you talking about? You blew up the shield wall, and now somebody's using weather control, and you've wiped out all of our forces in those 2 cities. I didn't know that could happen. I didn't plan for that. So yeah, that has existed in Dune. It always has. It's highly thematic and it's fantastic, but we don't think about it anymore because we're so used to it. That's going to happen with the expansion stuff. So play with it, try it out, give it a shot, see what you like. Some of the new stuff, especially in expansion 3, the modular variants are actually very easy to implement. They don't shake things up in an unpredictable way so much. Homeworlds are definitely, those are going to be for the players who are like, yeah, I grok everything that's going on right now in the game. And so now you're adding in that layer in. It is the most sophisticated variant that we have in there. It's not hard, but it's a new thing. You're paying attention to. It's one new thing that every faction can do, but the real thing that you're looking at are the levels. So you want to pay attention to how many reserves do you have, and when are you going to dip down to low threshold, and whose planet is vulnerable right now. And so that's another level to the strategic elements of Dune. So that's why I think it is a little bit more of an advance, but it's not hard to understand. It's easy to understand. It's just one more thing you're paying attention to. So you don't want to try to force your brain to mentat that sort of thing until you are able to deal with everything else in the game without having to think too much on it. You're like, I know what all these factions, I don't need to read somebody's faction sheet. I know what these factions do. Then you're ready for Homeworlds. That's really what it comes down to. But if you're like, oh, how does that assassinate thing work again? You're like, you know what? You focus on that. That's what you need to do right now. So hopefully this has cleared up some of the mystery of how we came about the different stuff for the game and how we design it. If you've got more questions or want to learn more about specific elements, don't hesitate to ask. It may not require a whole nother video, but I'm not afraid to make one. So that's it for this one. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you again soon.